I'm Erin Hawkins, and I have the pleasure of serving as one of two co-directors here at the Hanna Institute, alongside my partner in crime, Mr. Nicholas Dalton. So on behalf of all of us, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us tonight. For those of you who don't know, the Hanna Institute was established in 2016 as part of a broader vision of our Hanna Boys Center Board of Regents and our Executive Director, Brian Farraher, to take the work that we do here at the Boys Center, building resiliency and healing and hope, and to bring that out into our community. And we do that because the boys here, they come from community, they return to community, and anything we can do to prevent the trauma and the adversity that so often brings them here is, we believe, a worthy investment. So we do that work in a couple of different ways. We do it by partnering with wonderful agencies like the International Trauma Center and its founder, Dr. Robert Macy, to do training work and deep consultation work with agencies that serve our community. Our schools, our hospitals, our health systems, our probation department. And we do it by working in really deep partnership to help move our collective vision for a healthy and equitable community forward. And we're also very proud to be doing a bit more to expand our research repartee and to bring in brilliant minds like Dr. Joop, who we'll hear from tonight, to help us and inspire us to continue to do our work to heal our community. So I'm going to ask our Director of Research, Dr. Daniela Dominguez, to come up and introduce Dr. Jong.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. How are you doing? I hope you're enjoying your meal. I'm so very happy to be here today and to introduce Dr. Joop. Before I introduce him, if it's okay, I would like to tell you a little bit about the research that we're doing. So as the research director here at the Hanna Institute, one of the things that I've been really happy and proud and excited about is the community-based participatory action research that we have been doing in the community. And I see here that we have our research team in the back, Noemi and Richard. So we are a community-engaged research team. So we believe in actually going out in the community and collecting data. And you know, when I was born and raised in Mexico, and I come from a practice background, so I was a therapist for a few years at Texas State University, and I became really interested in educating the new generation of psychotherapists. When I moved into academia, I was a little concerned about, you know, moving from practice to research. I was like, I don't know if I really want to be in the lab. And the methodology that we're using is really exciting because it gives us the opportunity to go out to the streets and gather knowledge from the streets. So what we're focusing on as our first project for our community engaged research team is to really understand the stories of Latinos in Sonoma Valley, the Latinx population. So what we're focused on as of right now is to collaborate with our community partners and to understand what are the strengths, the resources, and the support systems that enable Latinos to thrive. So this community is a beautiful community, and we just want to shed light on the strengths that make us that beautiful community. So right now I'm going to introduce Dr. Joop. He's an emeritus professor of cultural and global mental health at UMC Amsterdam. He has worked and conducted research in post-conflict, disaster, and multicultural settings of immigrants. So check this out. He's just a star. He has co-authored 314 chapters and articles in peer-reviewed journals. He has published on cultural psychiatry, global mental health, public mental health, epidemiology, medical anthropology, and on the mental health of populations in humanitarian emergencies, with a special focus on refugees. He's advisor to the World Health Organization and other UN agencies, member of several boards of trustees, and member and advisor of various professional organizations. After obtaining his medical degree, Dr. Joop was trained in international and public health. He provided medical support in post-conflict situations in Senegal, Guinea, and Angola. He returned to the Netherlands, where he trained in psychiatry and 7 schools of psychotherapy. His research focuses, among other topics, on epidemiology, effectiveness and efficacy research, and mixed method studies among adults and children. In addition, Dr. de Jong is involved in several epidemiological studies of refugees and immigrants in the Netherlands and abroad, and in a number of networks that are active in the domain of public health and culture. And if I can ask you to give them a round of applause, I would really appreciate it.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your introduction, Danielle. 100 years ago, back in the old continent where I'm from, when there was a concert, you would just sit and chat and drink your coffee and your pastry and have a beer and make noise. So, although my talk isn't exactly going to be amusement tonight, but feel free to take your food even for the people who come in later. Okay, so I'm going to talk about public mental health. And these are the countries where I've worked over the past 40 years, often with Robert Macy together, and where we have set up programs. And so tonight I am going to give you a summarizissimo of what we have done all those years. So it's a kind of overview. Now this is the most theoretical part, and Robert and I have gone through my talk yesterday, and Robert said, okay, Joop, you have to add this as well and this as well. And I said, Robert, what's going to be, okay, Joop, do it. So, obedient as I am, this is a kind of a theoretical model that I use. I'll walk you very briefly through it. It says basically that we have our brainstem, our limbic system for the emotions, then we have our brain, our body, our family, our community, but to really understand how trauma is lived in different cultural and social contexts, you have to look at not only the social ecology, but also the history of both the individual and the group that the individual belongs to. And you have to look with a cultural lens at what you're doing. Like a stressor is always a culture-dependent issue. In anthropology, there's a big debate whether mothers who lose many children in Brazil, whether they kind of suffer less than Caucasian mothers who would lose a child. And then here you have the individual development, genetic vulnerability is a factor, birth itself, especially in many war zones, the development of the self, nutrition and malnutrition, attachment, socialization. So it's quite a complex model if you think about what you have to keep in mind when you want to develop interventions or when you want to do research. So this was the most difficult slide. The rest is quite easy. Now there is another concept that I developed, or I came up with it one day, and I call it the trauma escape. And I define it as the systemic dynamics of local and international representations and actions around extreme stress. Now there are many words to convey something quite simple. Is that when things happen in the world, bad things happen, there is a cascade of events that is determined by movie stars, by politicians, by the UN, and then something happens and nobody exactly knows why and where that happens and when, but then all these forces together, they kind of determine whether in a certain decade we are more interested in terrorism, human rights, child rights, good governance, gender-based violence, domestic violence, combat veterans and child soldiers. And then often that leads to where humanitarian funding is going. So you see here the tsunami in Sri Lanka, which was a media kind of event with which we easily identify, like we identify more easily with the war in the Balkan than in Sudan, where a few million people died and we hardly know about it. So it's good that we realize that trauma escape is a dynamic of local and global forces that has more influence on what happens out there when there is a war or a disaster than our very fancy epidemiological and scientific and humanitarian considerations. Okay, so I'm going to give you a few figures on global mental health, why we go towards a paradigm of public mental health, shortcomings of our common treatment models, and I'll spend a few words on the eternal debate on culture and psychopathology, tell you a few basic principles of a model, and then I'll summarize that public mental health paradigm in 2 steps. This is a very fancy thing. If you go a bit too quick, it doesn't. So why mental health? Here you see what the World Bank and the UN uses as the metric of disability and suffering caused by any disease in the world. When this was set up, there was no doctor involved, there were only economists. And they came up with this metric of the DALY. And the DALY is a disability adjusted life year. And you may say, for us, for today, it's 1 year of healthy life lost. Now if you look at the DALYs worldwide, you see that 28% of the DALYs are caused by neuropsychiatric disorders, as compared to 20% cardiovascular, respiratory 8%. So this was quite revealing when people found out that mental health has such an enormous impact on health, apart from disasters, apart from wars. With schizophrenia 2%, depression 10%, substance abuse having a big impact. So this was kind of a game changer when these figures came out. Then another reason, and this is not a beauty contest between Sonoma Valley and the Netherlands, but just to give you an impression. We have been calculating the figures over the weekend, and please look at these red figures. On average, in Sonoma Valley, 10,000 people have one family physician. In the Netherlands, that's 7 for 10,000 people. Here in Sonoma, we have 0.25 psychiatrists for 10,000 people. We have 8 times as many in my country. We have 0.7 for 10,000 psychologists, mental health providers. We have about 12 times more. Here in Sonoma Valley, we have 2.3 nurses for 10,000 inhabitants. In the Netherlands, we have 110, which is almost 40 times more. Now this is not because we are a communist country, we are favorites of we are adherents of the famous capitalistic model. We are old friends of the United States until recently, you might say. And so this is all paid for by the private insurance company. I pay $130 a month. I have a subtractable amount of $400 per year, and this pays this. Every single intervention you can imagine in health or in psychology, I get that from the system. These figures don't tell you what we have in public health. So I was concerned, I was the Health Commission of Amsterdam, and I calculated those figures for Sonoma County. Amsterdam having 40% more inhabitants than Sonoma County. I had a permanent staff of 700 full-time equivalents and a budget of 85 million euro per year just for public health, just for the city of Amsterdam, paid by the municipality. So when I discovered these figures and when we were digging and talking to many people, Wendy is here, we have seen many people who are Lynn, we were quite shocked and we were thinking, how are we going to do that? Now why I show this is that despite we have these amounts of people in my country, we are still moving towards public mental health. Because we realize that with all these people that we have, we can't close the treatment gap with the epidemiological figures of people that have problems and what we can offer. So we have to get to a new paradigm, and that's the public mental health paradigm. Okay. So here is another graphic illustration of the burden of mental health in red. So you see here for men from the age of 15 till the age of 79, what the burden is in another metric, which is years lived with disability, compared, for example, with musculoskeletal disorders. So for the elderly among you, you see that you pass a lot of critical phases in your life, so you can relax. Then I distilled from a very big study, the largest study in psychiatric epidemiological study in the world, from the World Health Organization with Harvard. I distilled a number of figures. It took me a long time. But this shows you the appalling state of affairs in global mental health. And in fact, it's a worldwide problem. Here you see high-income countries like your country, my country. These are the low-income countries. The burden of mental disorder, it's a bit different calculations, let's say 20%. We spend 5% on mental health, whereas the norm of the World Health Organization is 6 to 7% of the health budget. In low-income countries, the burden is 8%, they only spend 0.5%. Then here you see that on top, physical diseases, 48% of the people get treatment. For mental disorders, only 6%. In high-income countries, 65% for physical disorders and 24% for mental problems. Then the budget in low-income countries still goes for 70% to asylums, to psychiatric institutions. In high-income countries, that's a bit over 50%. Although we are deinstitutionalizing our asylums over the past 40 years. We really don't change the game. And then the people getting aftercare, sorry, very sensitive machine. In low-income countries, only 7%. In high-income countries, that's 45%. So people with mental disorders in high-income countries, they get 45% follow-up. We would never accept that when we talk about diabetes or hypertension or AIDS. So this is really quite shocking in my opinion. Okay, so let me explain why we like this public health, mental health, and what it is. It's the discipline, the practice, and the systematic social actions that's important that protect, promote, and restore mental health of a population rather than an individual. Does it mean we replace individual care? No, we do something in addition to individual treatment. Now, if you look at the effect of psychotherapy in the meta-analysis, then 30% are the universal variables that determine treatment, which we have in common with ministers and healers. Contextual variables are 40%. So this is where context of people determine the effect of the therapy. Whereas the technique that we practiced for so many years, like myself, I've been training for 50 years in psychotherapy, it only explains 15% of the effect. So, that's quite a bad investment, isn't it? Okay. So, therefore, working with the context instead of only working with the individual is important. Then, there's another argument, and that's what I show in the next slide. The light green areas of the world, that's this broad band of the world, that's where most political violence and where most disasters, big disasters take place and where they have enormous impact. These countries, in general, they have 3-4 clinical psychologists or very few psychologists and a few psychiatrists. Very limited numbers. I can mention in Africa where there was political violence, I can mention you 50 names of countries where there's 1 psychiatrist and 3 clinical psychologists for a whole country. Then, high versus low middle income countries. Low income countries have much more political violence, of a rate of 10 to 1. When there are natural disasters like cyclones and hurricanes, they take place more often in the West, but the casualties much more often take place in non-Western countries than in Western countries. This is just a short slide to show you where the displaced of the world today come from. Mostly from Afghanistan, almost 3 million, Syria, almost 5 million. They go, in general, they go to poor countries like Turkey, Pakistan and Lebanon. Lebanon, 1 of 2 of the populations, is now a refugee. We make a lot of noise with our populist parties in Europe. Day after tomorrow we have European elections. In the US we make a lot of noise. Only 18% of that burden around the world that we take on board. 18%. Whereas the brunt of the burden is taken by the Middle East and Africa, the poor countries that are in general over there. Okay, there it goes again. So on another level, why do we want public health? Is that in times of peace, we only reach, as I mentioned before, about 1/4 of the people who need care in high-income countries. Now I show September 11 because September 11 is in fact a beautiful example why public mental health is so important. Because September 11 on a global scale was a tiny disaster. It's a very, very small disaster. If you think about the earthquake in Sichuan, a few 100,000 people killed. If you think about Haiti, more than 100,000 people killed. Many of these war zones where there's 3, 4, 5, 800,000 people in Rwanda, 600,000 in Burundi. So it's a tiny disaster in a way. Now you all know that if you go to a Woody Allen film, that most people in New York, they have to visit an analyst a couple of times a week. So it has the highest density of psychotherapists in the world. They were trained in trauma-informed care. And they couldn't cope with the disaster, with its psychological consequences. It took the city of New York about a year to realize that they had to shift their model from an exclusive, dyadic, one-to-one psychotherapeutic model to a more community-based public mental health model. And that's what they did, and then they were more successful. So, there are a number of beneficiary factors when disaster strikes that complicate the treatment gap. Is that the people who get into trouble, they often express the psychopathology in other ways. Like the Latinx community here, when they talk about susto, or nervius, or ataques de nervius, that's something different than what we learn in DSM. They handle different explanatory models, and they may express their complaints in cultural syndromes, like nervius, or idioms of distress, like susto, and they may show other illness behavior. They may experience their suffering in spiritual terms, in religious terms. The family is disrupted, family suffers, and the beneficiaries often belong to different ethnic groups than the providers. So in fact you have here as well with the Latinx community. Then, concerning service delivery factors, we often have too few resources, especially when there's disaster. We just saw that. Then we have, around the globe, even fewer professionals, because when there is a war, people get killed, like during the Khmer Rouge time in Cambodia, or they escape their country, like in Rwanda. Our delivery models, they are often not prepared for massive stress, because we often have, around the world, we have colonial models of mental health, meaning big psychiatric hospital. But we are not prepared for large-scale disaster. Psychologists often have little training in trauma-focused therapy. And that's what the Hanna Institute has been trying to do over the last 3-4 years. Then the survivors often are in the rural areas, intellectuals, and the therapists in the city. And then the state sector is weak, which makes it very difficult to mobilize psychotherapists because they have to be private practice. When in private practice, you can't go out there to another area and always do your work. I mean, here it's different, but I talk about most places in the world. Okay, so if you want to do, this is what I show to students, if you want to get into this work how can you prepare yourself? So learn to think public health, which is difficult for psychologists and psychiatrists, because we are trained in always working one-to-one. Try to learn public health. Adapt your academic knowledge to cultural diverse situations, which is another challenge for us. Question the cultural premises of your own native culture, including the culture of your mental system, your mental health system. Try to understand different health systems, I'll get back to that, and try especially to stay creative. Because DSM and the guidelines we have, they often undermine our creativity. You know, we have this diagnosis in DSM, and then you have this protocol, and you have to follow that protocol, and then there are 48 of those protocols. And it kills your creativity as a therapist. So this is a simple picture of a health system. Very simple picture. Most of us, we understand this, the Ministry of Health and health insurance and private, for the family physicians and the mental health, we have some idea about this. These people are all also part of the health system. Finance Ministry, Education Ministry of Science, Public Health Department, universities, drug companies, NGOs, non-governmental organizations. This is what happens when there's disaster. So there's an enormous amount of people who come there. They fly in. There's the disaster tourists, they are the helpers of its students who get a ticket from a rich uncle and they fly into Aceh in Indonesia or in Thailand and they say, I want to help. Nobody knows what do we do with all these young kids coming who don't have any experience. It's a disaster in a disaster. Then the military come in, the rural developmentalists, the UN comes in with 7 agencies that are often as competitive among each other as the NGOs and the community-based organizations that are competitive. The diplomats, the blue helmets, human rights organizations, the disaster experts and the humanitarian agencies, like my previous NGO. And they all want to coordinate and nobody wants to be coordinated. So that's a big thing in disaster zones. I see Wendy smiling, she recognized that. Okay, there it goes again. Now, what is the term you use for this? I think complementary impact or something, that you want to join your forces, you have a term for that in the US. Well, this is what I want to show with this. We all agree with each other that if you do anything useful, you have to aim at resiliency, at well-being, empowerment, social support. We need to give information and communication, awareness building, sensitization. People have to understand what trauma is, what happens in their mind, that they are not going nuts, that it's a normal reaction to an abnormal event. So we should pool our resources here. And then the social people who are dealing with rape survivors, gender-based violence, child soldiers, disarmament, like the vets here, they should add to this pool. But what they often try, they want the money that should be here, they want to try to get that for their own programs. The same for the medical people, communicable, non-communicable disease, TB, diabetes, mental disorders, HIV. They don't pool their resources, they want them to take them away. The peace people, the truth and reconciliation, transitional justice, non-violence issues, and on top the economists with rural development programs, income generation, occupational skills training, microcredit programs, all very important. But everybody tends to do its own thing and puts its own flag, which is a big problem. So, a little side pass to, is psychopathology similar around the globe? Now, when DSM-5 came up, the Bible of the shrinks and psychologists, there was a big debate on how does culture influence psychopathology. Culture defines and creates specific sources of stress. I just mentioned that example of child mortality and how mothers react. So For example, when I die in sub-Saharan Africa, that's a reason for a big feast. You know, they say the guy is old, he's going to the realm of the ancestors, he has 2 kids, he had a nice career, and so let's slaughter the cows and all get drunk. If a child dies, that's another story. So what is stress and how mourning plays out in different cultures is very different. Culture changes illness experience. What you perceive as a problem, how you perceive it in your body, in your emotions. It influences the symptomatology and specific syndromes, like as I said before, the attackers in air rouge. It determines interpretation of symptoms and their cognitive social impact. So when I have, as a Cambodian, I have dizziness, then I think, oh my kyol, the wind that circulates through my body, in other vessels than my blood or my lymph, that kyol gets somehow, it leaves my ears, and then it causes my dizziness. And then my cognitive appraisal is very different than when we have dizziness and hyperventilation, because we think, oh, I may have a heart attack. They may say, well, my cognitive appraisal is that I become schut. I get a major mental disorder. Culture offers coping models, directs help-seeking behavior, whether we go to a healer, straight to a shrink, or we go first to the family physician, to social reactions to distress, etc. Now there's a big thing around the world that people say, oh, you know, immigrants and refugees, they express their problems in somatic complaints. That's a very stereotypical myth that's very hard to change, which is not true. If you look at the research, there's nice research showing that the Chinese and Latinx, when they migrate to America, they adapt to the idioms of the local American population. There's a beautiful study done in Montreal, where a psychologist, he saw Chinese patients, Chinese Canadian patients, and he did the same in China. And they went to the family physician and they all had somatic complaints. Only somatic complaints. And then they did a very smart thing. He went to the house in the evening and he said, you went today to your family physician and you only had somatic complaints. And then they said, oh yeah, but you know, I've got many, many problems. You know, my son is smoking weed. My daughter, she's dating a guy and we want to find a good husband for her. So the Chinese, they immediately came up with a whole bunch of psychosocial stressors that were behind their complaint. And then he asked, but why didn't you tell your family physician? Yeah, but that's a doctor. You know, I go to the doctor, you don't tell these complaints. So it's not that they're unable to know what's behind their somatic complaints and their pains, etc. It's just that often we don't know how to ask that. Okay. I'll say a few words on the interdependent construction of the self because that's interesting. Here in the West, we train our students and our children. We like them to be autonomous, to become independent. We cherish self-control, self-reflexivity, and we speak in psychology about ego strength and insight and volitional. In many non-Western cultures that are collectivistic or what we call social-centric, or that are interdependent instead of independent, we talk about a group ego. You Americans, Robert has told me that, explained that to me, I like this word, we-go. Group and social control is often more important. A group consciousness is more important, and we talk about an interactive ego or composed soul or self. And sometimes it goes very far. A couple of years ago I read in the paper in the Netherlands that a Laotian patient had sued his surgeon in California because he said, you know, you surgeon should have known that we Laotians, we have 29 parts of our soul. And one of those parts is in our leg. And you amputated my leg. And you didn't tell me that you, and I didn't know that you were taking away part of my soul. So this is just how complex these things can be and how far they can go. Now, when people come from a collectivistic culture and they think very much in terms of, if I do this, what would that mean for my brothers and sisters and for my family? And how do I take their wishes into account? We then, as psychologists, we tend to say, well, this person, you know, is a very avoidant person because he or she is not autonomous, because he or she is always wondering what the family thinks. So we call that avoidant, or we call that dependent personality disorder. Or when it comes to forensics, we say, well, that's quite an antisocial person. No? Because he's always talking about what his brother and his mother think, but that means there's a lack of interiorization of consciousness functions, so that's what we call a psychopath, at least in the Freudian literature. Okay, so this is important for our field to keep this in mind when we work across cultures. Then there's another issue. There's beautiful research showing that PTSD is a valid diagnosis, meaning wherever you go in the world and you do research, people recognize the syndrome of PTSD with its avoidance, with its arousal, with its nightmares, with its social isolation, with its numbed feelings. But the question is it very useful? Or does it have value around the world? That's what I tried to show with this slide. If you look at Latin America and this part of Africa, there are millions of people every week going in trance in apostolic and Pentecostal churches. Speaking in tongues and going in trance is not just about that the child has done something which you don't like. That's really a way of expressing a lot of distress in terms of dissociation. You see dissociative cults all over sub-Saharan Africa. Hundreds of them. They go till here in the Middle East. They were exported with colonialism to Brazil, to Candomblé, the Umbanda, the Kimbanda, to Cuba, Santeria Nanyikishmu, to Haiti, Voodoo, Suriname, Winti. So all these dissociative cults, they have a function in dealing with traumatic stress and going into trance. What you also often see, you see short-lived epidemics of distress that come up and that fade out over time. Like the Chinese, at a certain moment, a few 100,000 Chinese, they ran to shops and they wanted a specific salt, because the myth, the rumor was in China, if you don't take that salt, you get goiter cancer, thyroid cancer, because due to the nuclear fallout of the Fukushima disaster in Japan. So this is what you see, and in fact, many of the veteran syndromes that we see are similar to that kind of group phenomenon in China. Okay, now let me get to my model and first tell a few principles. It accommodates different age groups. It's resilience, ecology, family oriented. It uses a spectrum and continuum approach, meaning we go from smaller, lighter complaints to more serious complaints. You can integrate both into your model. It describes universal steps in an eclectic way, so you can pick out certain elements and integrate them, going from a few interventions for many to many for few. So what does it mean? You might say, okay, we set up a program in Sonoma County. We take the whole county and we focus on one intervention, and once that's running well, we add another intervention. Or you might say, no, we don't do that. We just take Sonoma Valley, with its 43,000 people, and we develop a number of interventions in Sonoma Valley. Once that goes well, we then spread out to other parts of the county. You may start bottom up and gradually collaborate with mental health services or academia or vice versa. So you might do this from from the University of San Francisco. You might work based on the Sonoma County in Santa Rosa. You may work based or initiated from the Hanna Institute. There are many ways of doing that. It's not totally different from day-to-day care. That's also important, because in our profession we tend to say, oh no, this guy is a post-war expert and this is a post-disaster expert. But what we do is in fact the same as you normally do, but we add some things. Because if we make specializations of everything, we disempower each other, because then you say, okay, I've never done this in disaster area, that's scary, I don't go there. Fits times of peace, disaster, conflict, and it's compatible with community-based model, with protective child rights model, the conservation of resource model, and other models, including these guidelines of the UN. I'll get back to that later. So, I get to the 2 steps. I skip this. I skip the slides on prevention. I think it's going to get too long. Just very briefly on resilience. We have always talked in psychology about resilience as an individual trait. So something happens in my life, and despite that adversity, I flourish. That's what we call resilience. Over the past years, we increasingly realize that it's not only the individual, but that all the assets on social, ecological levels around the person that have a relation with positive outcomes. Which is logical. If you have family support, you do better than when you don't have the family support. When after Katrina and after Andrew, it appeared that apart from the traumatic stresses that people suffered due to Katrina, that whether the insurance company paid or not for the destructed homes was a more important determinant of well-being 3, 4, 5 years for the disaster than the actual loss. So what the insurance company does, or sometimes in some countries what happens on the village level or on the regional level, is as important or even more important than the traumatic stress that the individual suffers him or herself. Okay, well, the first step is you collect a lot of data. That's what we in fact now are doing with our team. We are collecting a lot of data, we are talking, we try to understand what's going on. Then you have a massive database of statistics, of qualitative research that Danielle is doing with her team. Wendy has an enormous database. We have the health data of Sonoma County. And then you have to decide, okay, I've always too little money. How do I determine what I'm going to do? We use 10 criteria. The first is the needs of the community and their concerns. The second criterion is the epidemiological figures. Like in this region, there's about 20% alcoholism, there's about 20-30% depression, and there's a lot of domestic violence. That's the kind of epidemiological figures. The community concern, very briefly, is something that you do with social science and anthropological techniques. Key informant interviews, in-depth interviews, focus groups. You collect data, you analyze them, and in a few weeks or 2 months, you know what's going on in the community, and you can, in fact, use those data to distill guidelines for a program. Epidemiology, culturally informed epidemiology, is very difficult. It's quantitative, it's science, you have to adapt your instruments, you have to collect the data, and that may take 2 to 3 years. But they are complementary, the concern and the prevalence, the rates. You understand here that these people on top in southern Africa have very different concern. Of this woman in Ethiopia living in a tent, every family member has 1 square meter of carton, 3 taps for 3,000 people, and this is China 1 year after Sichuan earthquake. Everybody living in a nice little cubicle with a table and a TV and a fridge. So seriousness is an issue. When you decide what you want to do, you want to also think about how serious is the problem, how disruptive is it, how many daddies go along with it, how many human suffering is involved. Then you have to question, is it treatable? Do I have the experts, the psychologists, the mental health professionals who can do this? Is it sustainable? Sustainability is always a big issue. And that shows this slide very briefly. Sustainability is a matter of quality and volume and time. What does that mean? If you want a sustainable program, you have to train enough people. But people tend to go away, they find other jobs. Low-income countries in Africa, many people die due to AIDS. So you have to train new people all the time. The volume is big, the quality is a big issue because you train them, but without supervision, without refresher training, it doesn't work either. And you have to maintain your program over time and make sure that it also becomes financially sustainable. I don't want to go very deep into this, but in our experience, if you want to set up a public mental health program that's sustainable, you need to invest 5 to 10 years before it really works and stands on its own feet. A number of countries I've set up programs, now I have 100 to 200 staff or 300 staff members over the past 20 years. So it took us 10 years to set it up. Okay, then we go on. You need to know what your health workers or your psychologists, what they know, and how many jobs they have already to do, what their load is before you can add something in terms of training. Then you have to know what you do, whether that's politically acceptable, whether the people like it, whether it's ethical acceptable, whether it's culture sensitive, and whether it's cost effective both on an individual and societal level. Because many donors and the World Bank, they just say, oh guys, your program is $2 per person per year in a low-income country. That's much too much. If we give an anti-parasite, anti-war treatment, it's only $5 or treatment against night blindness, it's only $5. So you have to compete with other programs, and that's a very hard world. So you have to come up with cost-effectiveness data, and which, by the way, I think you also would need here to convince your government of California. Okay, so then these criteria that we just had, these 10 criteria, they're quite judgmental and subjective. You can say if you're a scientist, you may say, well, I really go for epidemiology. If you are very much into cultural sensitivity, you say, I think that ethnic background or ethnic identity is more important for me to take into account. Or whatever, if you're an economist, a health economist, you will say the money aspect is very important for me. Once you have sorted it out and quarreled a lot and got it on paper, you then this machine, I don't know, I think I have sticky fingers. I'm too slow for this thing. So, I'm going to show you what I call the public mental health building. Multimodal, multisexual, multi-level public mental health. Multisexual means, or intersexual, it's a typical UN term, is that if you want to do this, you have to work through health, through social affairs, through education, through women's organizations, through whatever other sectors are important in your community. So, let me first show you the matrix, but I will also show you that in public health we love triangles. This is the classical thinking of triangles. So this is an inverted triangle, so here you start with political survival interventions and then you go down to people who have a lot of need, psychotherapy and medication. This afternoon our team, Erin, with Nick and Danny and Frank and Richard, we sat down and we made this improvised kind of pyramid of Sonoma Valley. With mindfulness is going on, Avance is doing work, the community health works, all kinds of people, and then on top of this public health pyramid, here are the more specialized services like Aurora or the Crisis Stabilization Unit. I show that here in another way. In this public mental health building, you plot interventions that you would normally do on the national, international level, community level, or family level. And here you put the universal, the selective, and the indicated interventions. Now, for those of you who are not trained in this field, a universal intervention is targeted at all people, let's say, vaccinations for children. In my country, where everywhere is too much water, swim. If we can't swim, as the Dutch, you drown. That's a universal intervention. The mindfulness program that's currently spread out in this area, it's typically universal intervention. It's down in the pyramid, it's not specialized, and it tries to reach many people. The selective preventive interventions is targeted at subgroups whose risk of developing a problem is significantly higher than average, maybe imminent or lifetime risk. So think of an accumulation of risk factors like low socioeconomic status, acculturative stress, traumatic stress, like the undocumented people here. There are a group where you would say we would very much like to develop selective interventions for them because they show a number of risk factors which are higher than the average risk of the whole population. Indicated preventive interventions are interventions for people who really have a lot of problems, either because they have had a psychosis, or they had a psychosis when they were smoking cannabis, or because there's very serious domestic violence, etc. And then you can plot your interventions in this matrix, and it helps you also to distinguish a bit what should internationally, what should the UN do, what should the government do, that's mostly here, and what should the NGOs and the community-based interventions do. And here you see some of these interventions like universal, peace education, conflict resolution in many situations in the world, setting standards for intervention and training, research, also child rights advocacy. Here you see like what we also will try to do here, what you're already doing, psychoeducation after the fires, community sensitization, awareness raising using radio, TV or theater. And then here you have like on the family level, non-violent upbringing in families and non-violent education in schools, which is of course a problem all over the world. It's not that teachers like to beat up the children, parents nowhere in the world like to beat up their children, but they don't know how to raise children another way. So there are many interventions that you can train parents, even 1 or 2 sessions, and then they say, well, this is nice because now I know how I raise my children without beating them up all the time. Here, this is typically selective interventions where our program would focus. Public health, disease control, mental health, psychosocial support. And then we now have a whole bunch of interventions. These are the WHO guidelines to train family physicians in basic mental health care. Here you see a whole bunch of guidelines. This is again family, the population level. We have guidelines to do simple interventions. We have more complex guidelines for psychological interventions, etc. This one is an interesting intervention that's being developed. It's similar to what you're doing here now, the SPR in this region. It's called Problem Management Plus. If we would develop a program here, I would love us very much to do this. Because this is a good intervention. It's effective, shown in a number of randomized control trials. it's a combination of problem-solving counseling with stress management, with behavioral activation, and helping people to strengthen their social support. It's only 5 sessions, 1.5 hours. It's either a group format or an individual format. It can be delivered to adults and to children and adolescents. And it doesn't need highly trained psychotherapists and mental health professionals. So you can train this to lay people in the community who have certain, of course they should qualify with certain standards like empathy, social intelligence, etc. But with supervision, this works very well. And you can train this in people who have no experience in 4 or 5 days. So this is good intervention, and the version for children is called EASE. Okay, I'm coming at the end. So I show you a few slides of Cambodia, how we do this work out there in the third world. Here, this is one of our counselors doing psychosocial education in a village, the people sitting there. This is kind of material he uses. This person is thinking about poverty, about violence, about the war, about the drought, about floodings, about urbanization. And then this tries to show you may kind of get traumatic stress symptoms with startling reactions, hyperarousal, or sit down depressed, or start drinking. Okay. Conclusion. So what I try to tell with this bucket mental health model is that it accommodates a variety of preventative and curative interventions. It's multisectoral, it's multimodal, it combines different treatment modalities. It's multi-level, it's systemic, you can do things on different levels of your community, and you can pick them in an integrative and eclectic way. If you want to do prevention, I didn't talk much about prevention, but you have to, of course, to mold it to the requirements of the context where you are working. It tells you some things about how different actors can collaborate instead of compete. It shows how the sectors of health, education, social affairs, human rights, gender, etc. can work together. It also helps us to identify gaps in our knowledge and to see where you have evidence-based interventions in this public mental health building and where you need to develop interventions or develop culturally adapted interventions in your specific area where you are working. It also shows that if you have a limited number of mental health professionals, that you have to involve them in what we call task sharing and task shifting, so that the psychologists and the nurses and the psychotherapists, that they spend part of their time training others in these more basic interventions, so that you get an oil stain effect, that these people, they train people in the community leaders, lay people out there with or without a financial incentive, mostly hopefully with a financial incentive, and then trying to cover large groups of people instead of only having specialized care for a small elite that has the money to pay for a counseling session or a psychotherapeutic session, which is of course very good that it happens, but it doesn't cater for the people who are most in need in their community out there. Okay, that was a long sit. I must say I'm really admiring you, you know, after a long day of working. And, you know, it's very silent, everybody is very attentive, so, but this was the end of my talk. Thank you for your attention.
Are there questions for Dr. Young? I'll pass the mic around.
Yeah, so you described a 5-session therapeutic intervention that does problem solving, self-esteem. How does it work? What happens in this 5 hours?
Well, I think when disaster strikes, people first, they tend to get very, very demoralized. And when things don't work out, and when you don't get a house, and you don't get this, or you don't get that, people tend to kind of go in a mode of helplessness and hopelessness. And so when people learn in these sessions to problem solve, and they start with small things, and then they see that those small steps forwards that they work, then the problem solving kind of changes the whole helplessness, hopelessness. When people, they feel like they're socially isolated because they came from a close-knit community, like they have here as well, and then they are dispersed by the fires and they come in a community where they don't know anybody. Then making small steps despite that hopelessness and building up a new social network, getting acquainted with a few people, guiding that process, those are really kind of tipping points elements that may change the whole game in the mind of people. So of course it's not a magic bullet, but the evidence, the randomized controls trials show that it works and that people often get much better. Yeah?
You have such an abundance of what we might call, I guess, psychological, epidemiological information about the globe. I'm wondering what data there is that draws correlations between the maldistribution of mental health services for the poorer or strata of any country, correlating that to negative social outcomes. In other words, to what extent does the absence of mental health services across a population contribute negatively to the life outcomes for that population?
Yeah. Well, there is of course many ways of answering your question. There is a very big literature showing that almost all mental problems in the world have to do with trauma. There are even epidemiologists and experts in chronic psychosis, schizophrenia, they say nobody ever gets schizophrenia without very big burden of trauma. Then there is another huge amount of literature showing that people who have mental health problems, and mostly those are the poor, and mostly they don't get access to services, or if they go get access to services, they get access in a very late stage when the psychosis has become chronic. If people don't get access, they are handicapped in many domains of life. So, first of all, you see a lot more of obesity, you see a lot more of substance abuse, you see a lot more of what we call metabolic syndrome, with diabetes, all kinds of internal diseases, much more divorce, much lower job attainment and salary attainment levels in the life, and much less cognitive development. So poverty is a disaster. Poverty and inequality, you might say, is the major thing worldwide in the globe. It's the driving determinant about all ill health, physical and mental. And in fact, socioeconomic inequality around the globe is also the most important determinant of war. So if you look at the 5 major risk factors of war, socioeconomic inequality between countries and within countries comes always first. Then you have demographics, and then you have ethnic clashes, and then you have religious clashes, and then you have problems of who steals the resources in the country, etc. But those are less important risk factors than the poverty and the socioeconomic inequality.
Well, so the obvious follow-up is the return on investment in mental health services versus other social services.
Yeah. Yes.
What sort of analytical information do you have?
In the US alone, there are really a lot of studies that show if you invest in mental health, if you invest in prevention, you do that in an early stage. That you, I mean, these figures in the US, they're always appalling, you know, because then the figures, they talk about trillions of dollars. But that's not what happens. It has a very large cost effectiveness. We even in a cost effectiveness study that the World Bank funded, where Robert and I met the first time, we did interventions in Cambodia, and we showed that in Cambodia, if we invest $4 in a person, including the petrol of his moped, including getting to the village, including getting the people under the mango tree and doing the group sessions, that the return in a month is $14 per month. And why? Because that person is remoralized, because a person needs less day laborers to work to till his field. He pays less out of pocket to get drugs in the drugstore. He visits healers less, etc., etc. And so there's a very big return on investment when you do this kind of work. And many data on this. Yeah. Somebody wants to, yes.
Well, you talked about the
Or shall I
various...
get you the phone?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Because-
Well, I have a pretty loud voice.
Don't take it personal. They're taping this for people who want to see this later.
So you spoke about different centers or different areas like SF State or the Hanna Institute as areas or think tanks or places where this kind of work can happen.
Yes.
What is the likelihood, the cost, the feasibility of the Hanna Institute being this kind of starting point for Sonoma Valley, for Sonoma County, for California?
Depends on you.
What does it take?
You are all here. I mean, yeah, I think, yeah, I think it takes, first it takes a lot of commitment, long-term commitment. I can't oversee how much investment it costs, because I think if you want to make this sustainable, and with the current politics that you have in the US, there's not a chance that this is going to change big in the next 5 or 10 years. So you will go for cheap interventions as much as possible in the community, but taking care of people who need more serious kind of assistance in terms of, for example, when it's domestic violence or when it's depression or more serious depression. I think that a Hanna Institute could be very much the pivot of this, but only when it works with all the other actors. So you really need a network, and you need to develop that network and maintain that network and get all the players on board. So this afternoon we went to, and then they said, Joop, there are kind of 90 non-profits in this area. So, you know, I said, well, and then I think Nick said, but one is also looking for Yetis in Tibet or something. They were doing things.
White tigers.
The black tigers.
White
tigers.
White tigers.
Okay. So at least that's not mental health. So there were many of them who are not involved in our field, but but you need to know all these resources, large or small, what they can do or what they can provide in terms of human resource training capacity or human resource intervention capacity, service delivery in the community. I think it's only a matter of will. I mean, we have done this in countries, like when I started in Cambodia, there was not one psychiatric nurse, not one social worker, not one psychiatrist or psychologist. Now there's a faculty with there are a few hundred psychologists in the country, a few dozen of psychiatrists, and they cover 1/4 of the country with services. And we did that in 8 years, from 92 to 2000, and then stood on its own feet. So here you have many more means, but still it's difficult because you have more means, but you also have a much more complex social map and much more complex asset map of who's doing what. But I think it's totally feasible.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm wondering if there's any experience not delivering this kind of work through agencies, but through other channels of distribution that are already in place. Let's say teacher training. A teacher has so much time with a child. Is it feasible that this kind of work could be delivered through the school systems?
Yes. Yes, thank you. Yes. What Robert has been doing a lot, Robert Pacey, in many different places, is that he has developed a classroom-based intervention where children get into groups, and these groups can have a mixture of, you want to say something about it, Robert? A mixture of cognitive behavioral elements, of exposure elements. There's a lot of dancing, so children learn to handle their arousal levels by the trauma and how to tune that down. And so he has developed that. We've done a couple of randomized controlled trials, and it was effective in at least 2 of the 4 countries where we have done that. There were other factors playing a role where it wasn't effective. So that's one of the interventions that you can do in the school or after school time. So that's very feasible, yes. And in fact, that should happen. I think schools are the place where you find the children with a lot of problems. And then I think one of the challenges for us would be how to deliver that through the schools and the school counselors, etc. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Sit here.
I would just like to know if there are, it seems to me your model can scale up and scale down.
Yeah.
Are there locales, either in the United States or other European countries or other countries where you've worked, where the model has been put into effect in communities of our size, for example?
No, the model hasn't been applied not in that way in Europe, but there are similar models that have been applied, but very seldom in a systematic way. But what we have done in many places in the world is that we start with a small pilot area, and that's why I think Sonoma Valley would be ideal. We understood today that Sonoma Valley is regarded as an underdeveloped service provision area compared to some other areas in the county. So I think that would be an ideal size of 44,000 inhabitants to develop the model, and then see whether you can roll it out. Is that an answer to your question?
It does. I would think that to some extent, though, if we were to attempt to implement it here in Sonoma Valley, we would be able to access, if we were to attempt to implement it here in Sonoma Valley, we would be able to access the other locales that have implemented parts of the model or tried to implement the model, just so we have a basis of understanding of what works and what doesn't in smaller communities.
Yes. Yeah. So one of the things we will try, we will do randomized controlled trials, but there are also things going on that should continue to go on and that will help. Because like the mindfulness program where Frank and Paco are involved in that mindfulness training, and the county as well. I think that's really an asset for us. It's kind of it helps us to create a foundation on which we can build other building blocks. If things are happening in the community already, and we think that's really beautiful what they do there, we can kind of ask them to come over and train the other villages or the other communities.
Yeah.
So I think it's really getting the positive things together and make a package which you then can plot in such a public health kind of delivery model where you say, okay, do we have enough for the family, or do we have enough for the people who have problems with substances, or do we have enough for children with learning difficulties? So you kind of can plot that out and then see how you get cross-fertilization in different villages in different parts of the county.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other final questions at the end? Well, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Can we get one last round? If you would like to request a PDF of the presentation or for chapters and more information about his work, we have a sign-up sheet outside. You can also join our mailing list and you can request that information. We'd be happy to send it to you. But again, on behalf of the Hanna Institute and the Hanna Boys Center, thank you all so much for joining us tonight and for sharing this work together. And please take some flyers on our upcoming Community Breakfast Speaker Series. So our next speaker is June 6th. That's Dr. Nancy Jong. She's an incredible advocate on equity and social justice in schools and in businesses. And then in September 12th, we have the amazing and incredible, and I don't know what I'm going to do when I meet her, Dolores Parthak, coming to speak to our community. So I hope you'll join us all then. And again, thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you.